God's peace to you on this Wednesday of Holy Week, where we are looking at the Passion of Jesus as told by Matthew. I will begin today with Matthew 26, verse 47, and then I will continue through to the end of 27, verse 10. So the Gospel according to Matthew. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs, and the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword and drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen this way?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who was it that struck you?" Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And after a little while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." And then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." And at that moment the cock crowed. And then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. And when the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. And they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And he said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." And after conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. And for this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom the price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. One of the most terrifying passages in the Gospel of Matthew, if not in all of Scripture, comes near the end of Christ's Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. And on that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many deeds of power in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Go away, you evildoers.'" Just a few chapters later, right after telling us not to be anxious, because we are of more value than the sparrows that God cares for, he echoes these earlier comments on denial by saying, "Everyone therefore who acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father in heaven." Denial cuts deeply. Anyone who's been through a divorce can tell you that there is little that is as painful as hearing someone who has been your beloved say to you, "I don't love you anymore," or "I don't wish to be with you anymore," or "I don't even know who you are anymore." I do not. Peter denied Jesus once. That would have been painful. But 3 times? 3 times shows intentionality. It shows determination. There's huge power in having 3 denials. Peter understands this at the crack of dawn when he remembers Christ's words, and his regret comes pouring out of him in bitter tears. Peter has always been the passionate disciple. He was the enthusiastic follower, especially in Matthew. He's the first one to call Jesus not only the anointed Messiah, but the Son of God. Peter's the one who jumps out of the boat in the middle of a storm in order to walk on water toward Jesus. He's the one who passionately proposes building 3 booths, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah at the Transfiguration. He's got a rash enthusiasm for following Jesus, even to the previous evening where he's made this very strong announcement that though all desert him, he will never desert Jesus. And now his enthusiasm and his passion and his love has ended with these really cutting, bitter words. I do not know the man. If Peter was the star pupil, Judas was, obviously, as the betrayer, the least among the disciples. He doesn't even make an appearance in Matthew until chapter 10, where the disciples are named. And then he's at the bottom of the list with a little tag on the end saying the one who would betray him. He doesn't get a call story like Peter did. We don't see him down by fishing nets. In fact, we don't even know what he did for a living before he followed Jesus. We don't see him at tax collectors' tables like Matthew. We just have his name, the betrayer. And then he doesn't get mentioned again until this passage that I've been reading to you. He gets mentioned at the supper, and all he says there is the same thing that all the other disciples said. Surely not I, Lord. I can't be the one who will betray you. But beyond that, he's really mysterious. And some of the other gospels speculate about why he betrayed Jesus, but Matthew doesn't. He just has him go to the religious authorities and ask, what will you give me in order to betray him? That's it. He doesn't say, I was upset that he allowed a woman to anoint him as king. He didn't say Jesus was blaspheming and calling himself Messiah. He didn't say, I was upset that he was a phony, a hypocrite who allowed expensive perfume to be poured over his head rather than the value of it given to the poor like he's always preaching. He didn't say, I want to steal the money from the purse. He just goes to the authorities and asks, what will you give me? His words at the Last Supper, the same words, surely not I, Rabbi. His motivation is as mysterious as he is. We get maybe a little bit of a hint as to what was going on in his head by the way he betrayed Jesus. The famous Judas kiss. If two men at this time and in this culture have unequal social status, and a rabbi versus a student would be unequal social status, the man with the lower status greets the man with the higher status by falling to his knees or even sometimes to his face in front of the man with the higher status. If two men of equal status greet each other in the streets, they give one another a kiss on the cheek. And when you see that happening, everyone who sees that happen understands what's being said there. And what's being said there is, you are no different from me. We are of equal standing, you and I. We have the same honor rating. Neither of us is above the others. I have no idea if that's what Judas was trying to say. Had he lost faith in Jesus that as a rabbi, the Messiah, or even as the Son of God? Did he think Jesus was a fraud? Just another man like him? That kiss was the ultimate denial. I deny and reject everything you claim to be, Jesus. But about the reasons for the kiss, like I said, I'm speculating. We're just not told what was going on in his head and his heart until it's too late. We are told after Jesus was condemned that he repented. And then we know what's on his heart. That he had regret, that he had sorrow for his betrayal. And he describes what he's done out loud as a sin against innocent blood. And he tries to undo it. Even throwing blood money that it was paid to him on the temple floor. But he can't undo the betrayal. He can't regain his honor. And so he ultimately is judge, jury, and executioner of himself out of dishonor and regret. Two disciples. Peter and Judas, just days and weeks before this, they were reclined together at supper with Jesus, hearing him teach into the evening about faithful servants versus faithless servants, listening to parables about young bridesmaids who didn't have oil in their lamps when it was time to celebrate. Stories about servants who had everything that was entrusted to them taken away from them because they were not faithful servants. They listened together when he talked about a judgment day where people would stand before the throne of God and they would ask of God, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't take care of you? They were two disciples of equal standing. And they are equal right now in their denial and in their regret, and they're equal in their lack of hope, as they equally know that death will swallow up the one they have equally abandoned to die alone on a cross. Death announced in both men's lives, I will have a victory. I will swallow up your so-called Son of God, your passion, your pleading, your regret, your offers of reconciliation. Nothing you can do will keep me from my victory. You can do nothing. Those words of denial are the hardest for us to hear. You can do nothing in the face of death. Early on in this COVID-19 epidemic, there was a meme that was circulating on the internet that said, our grandparents were called to war. You're being called to sit on the couch. You can do this. But we can't, can we? When called upon to do nothing, we go stir crazy or declare ourselves the exception to the rule. When shown our powerlessness in the face of an invisible enemy, we bargain and we rationalize and we weep bitterly and we despair. And Jesus knew this about us. He knew even his closest disciples could not, by their own strength or understanding, know him. Sinfulness, weak flesh, fallen and broken humans would never be free in the face of death. And the invisible enemy of sin that holds us in such great bondage. Even his star disciple would deny him and desert him, and his betrayer would be a failed betrayer. I mean, he didn't even follow through. He tried to undo the backflip halfway through. Sin would snap up both of his disciples and leave them helpless in the face of death. And what did Jesus say in the middle of all this sin and this denial and this death? Nothing except, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus knew who his enemies were. Not priests and not soldiers, not betrayers and not deniers. His enemies were sin, death, and the devil. And with as few words as possible, he walked into their open, waiting jaws. His only battle cry were these words of hope, that those Shekinah clouds of God's glory and the justice and power of his throne would be doing for Peter and Judas and Caiaphas and the council elders and scribes and Pharisees and sinners and tax collectors and you and me, what they could not and we would not do for ourselves. Defeat death. Amen.